Hi everyone, today I'm going to introduce my beta version of the Gyroflow OFX plugin for DaVinci Resolve, as well as a new workflow for dealing with anamorphic footage. I think the current version of the Gyroflow OFX plugin for DaVinci Resolve has some issues when working with anamorphic footage. I've been contributing some changes to the project and developing a workflow that makes it much easier to use Gyroflow directly inside DaVinci Resolve color page with anamorphic footage. So let's begin by looking at what the issue actually is. I'm going to use some footage I shot on my Sony camera with a Blazer Talon 1.5x anamorphic lens. I think this is a perfect example for demonstrating the problem. First, let's look at how the original version of Gyroflow behaves. For my project setup, I'm using a 2.4 to 1 timeline resolution. Under image scaling, I'm using scale full frame with crop. Normally, I would de-squeeze the footage using clip attributes. I simply set the pixel aspect ratio to the current 1.5x value and then bring the footage into the timeline. I already have my LUT applied at the timeline node, so now we can directly add the Gyroflow effect. And immediately you can see the problem. Look at how much Gyroflow is cropping the image. A lot of this crop is completely unnecessary. The issue is that Gyroflow doesn't correctly account for the geometry of the footage after it has been de-squeezed. If I manually adjust the FOV right now and try to zoom back out, you can see that we still can't recover the full image that should actually be available. So next, let's try another workflow. Instead of de-squeezing the footage first, we apply Gyroflow to the original squeezed footage, and then de-squeezed it afterward. This way, Gyroflow still has access to the complete raw frame before the de-squeeze transformation. But if we look at the result, Gyroflow is still cropping much more than necessary. Now, because the de-squeeze happens after Gyroflow, if I manually reduce the FOV, you can see that the original image information is actually still there. So technically, we can work around the problem this way, but it isn't very practical. We would have to manually determine the correct crop and ideally check throughout the entire clip to make sure there isn't a frame where stabilization moves outside the average image area. That takes time, and it can also be inaccurate if we miss a frame. So this is where the new input squeeze ratio parameter comes in. What this parameter does is adjust the frame boundary that Gyroflow uses when calculating its automatic cropping. All you need to do is enter the squeeze ratio of your source footage. In this example, I'm using a 1.5x anamorphic lens, so I simply set the input squeeze ratio to 1.5. Now, Gyroflow understands the actual usable image area and can calculate the automatic crop correctly. This makes the entire workflow much easier when working with anamorphic footage. Of course, for the best stabilization result, you should still use a proper calibrated lens profile. Personally, I prefer to preserve the original lens distortion of my anamorphic lenses. So in this example, I'm setting lens correction to 0. Now, let's look at the result. You can see that Gyroflow is only applying approximately the minimum crop needed for stabilization, while the footage itself is stabilized properly. And that's really the goal of this workflow, preserving as much of the original anamorphic frame as possible while still getting the benefits of gyro-based stabilization. This is actually my first time contributing to an open source project, and I think this improvement can be really useful for anyone shooting anamorphic footage. Especially if you want to stabilize anamorphic footage directly inside DaVinci Resolve. I think this workflow can give you a much cleaner and more predictable result. Gyroflow is open source, and this version will also be completely free. And if you'd like to support my work, feel free to check out my own plugin Anamorphic tool. It includes a number of tools specifically designed for anamorphic shooters and anamorphic post-production workflows. Thanks for watching. I hope you find this useful.